afraid to love again after heartbreak or loss? My husband Dan died on a Tuesday, which sounds like a weird detail to remember, but it's the thing that sticks with me the most because Tuesdays are so boring. Nothing bad is supposed to happen on a Tuesday. He had a heart thing nobody knew about. A widowmaker, they call it. He was 34. He went for a run like he did every single morning, and he just didn't come back. A neighbor found him 2 blocks from our house, and by the time I got the call from the hospital, there wasn't really anything left to decide. He was already gone before I even picked up the phone. I was 32. We'd been married 4 years, together for 7, and I remember thinking in the hospital hallway, with my sister's arm wrapped around me, that I would never be a person who wanted anything again. I didn't want food. I didn't want music. I definitely didn't want another person touching me for the rest of my life. I told my sister that straight up. I said, Katie, I am done. I am going to be one of those old ladies with 12 cats and a garden. And that's fine. That's a whole life. People do that. For almost 2 years, I actually kind of lived that life. Not the cats part, but the closing off part. I worked. I saw my sister on Sundays. I went to a grief group in a church basement that smelled like old coffee, and I existed. I wasn't sad every single day anymore, which people don't tell you about grief, that eventually it's not a wave, it's more like weather. Some days are just cloudy and you function fine. But the idea of dating, of letting someone new into that space, felt like it would be cheating. Not on Dan exactly, but cheating on the version of myself that had built a whole safe, boring life around never getting hurt like that again. There was a woman in that grief group named Pam who lost her husband of 31 years, and she used to say the same thing every single week. She'd say, grief doesn't ask permission, it just moves into the house and rearranges the furniture, and you spend the rest of your life either fighting it or making room for it. I used to roll my eyes at that a little because it sounded like something you'd read on a poster, but sitting here now writing this out, I think Pam was the only honest person in that whole basement. Everyone else was performing being okay. Pam just admitted she wasn't, and somehow that made the rest of us feel less crazy. I kept Dan's side of the closet exactly the way it was for over a year. His work boots by the door, his half-empty bottle of that cologne sitting on the bathroom shelf like he was just going to walk back in and use it. My sister tried gently a few times to get me to donate some of it, and I always found a reason not to. Yet, not this month. Not right before his birthday. Not right after the anniversary. There's always a reason not to when you're the one deciding, and nobody can make you. It's the loneliest kind of power you can have. Deciding alone when you're finally ready to let go of somebody's shoes. My sister is the one who signed me up for the dating app. I didn't do it myself, I want that on the record. She did it while we were watching a movie and drinking wine, and she made the profile using pictures from my cousin's wedding. I found out 3 days later when I had 11 messages sitting in an app I didn't remember downloading. I was furious for about a day, and then I was curious, which honestly scared me more than the furious did, because curious meant some part of me wasn't done yet. I matched with a guy named Ray. He was a contractor, built decks and additions, mostly self-employed, had a golden retriever named Biscuit in like 4 of his 6 photos, which is exactly the kind of unserious detail that got me to actually respond. He was funny in a dry way, texted in full sentences, which after some of these other guys felt like meeting a whole different species. We talked for 2 weeks before we met in person, which for me was already a miracle, because I kept finding reasons to cancel, and he kept being patient about it. Not pushy patient, just saying, whenever you're ready, no pressure. Our first date was coffee, not dinner, because dinner felt like too much of a commitment of time and eye contact. I remember walking in 10 minutes early so I could sit down first and control the moment, which is such a widow move if you know. He showed up in a flannel with sawdust actually still on his forearm, like he'd come straight from a job, and he apologized for it. And I told him it was fine, and it really was fine. It felt normal. It felt like something that could have happened in my old life, the one before. Here's where it gets strange. He stood up to get us both refills, and when he leaned across the table to take my cup, his jacket brushed past me, and I smelled him for the first time. Really smelled him. And it hit something in my chest like a hand closing around it. It was Dan's cologne. Not similar, not close. It was the exact same one. This specific drugstore brand Dan wore since college. The kind you can smell from across a room. I actually said something out loud. I said, "Oh," and Ray looked at me, confused, and asked if he had knocked something over. I didn't tell him what it was. I just said, "Sorry," I zoned out for a second. And he let it go because that's who Ray is. He doesn't push. But I sat there for the rest of that coffee basically on autopilot, smiling, nodding, answering questions, while some other part of my brain was back in my kitchen 4 years earlier, watching Dan get ready for work, spraying that same exact smell onto his neck twice. Always twice. Never once. Never 3 times. After that first coffee date, I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I called my sister and told her I couldn't do this again, and she asked what happened, and I couldn't even explain it properly over the phone. I just kept saying, "He smells like Dan, Katie. He smells exactly like Dan." She went quiet for a second, and then she said, "Okay, so what do you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know," which was the truest sentence I'd said in probably a year. I texted Ray that night to cancel our second date. I typed out a whole paragraph about being not ready and needing more time, and I actually hit send. Then I sat there staring at the little delivered notification, feeling like I'd done the responsible, healthy thing. Not even 10 minutes later, he texted back, completely unbothered. "Totally understand, no pressure. Whenever, if ever, works for you." Something about how easy he made it. Not a fight, not a guilt trip, just space. Made me delete my next 3 attempts at a follow-up text explaining myself further. We ended up rescheduling for the following weekend, and I told myself it was just to be polite. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it's not a cute story. It's actually kind of a mess. I didn't tell Ray why I liked him so much that first month. I told myself it was his laugh, it was Biscuit, it was the way he listened when I talked about my job. But if I'm being fully truthful, the smell of him walking into a room did something to my nervous system that felt like relief, like coming home, and I let that relief drive the whole relationship without asking myself a single hard question about it. We got serious fast, probably too fast. 3 months in, he was leaving toothbrushes and flannel shirts at my place. 5 months in, he basically lived there. Biscuit had his own bed in my living room, and some mornings I would wake up before him and just lie there breathing him in with my eyes closed. And for a few seconds, every single time, I would forget which life I was in. That should have scared me. It did scare me a little, but not enough to stop it, because stopping it meant losing the feeling, and the feeling was the closest thing to Dan I'd had in 2 years. My sister noticed before I did, or maybe she noticed before I let myself notice. We were at her kitchen table folding laundry, and she asked me straight out, "What is it about him?" And instead of answering with anything about Ray's personality, or his job, or the way he made me laugh, I said his smell. First, without even thinking about it. I watched her face change. She didn't say anything mean about it. She just got quiet and asked, "Have you told him about Dan yet?" And I said, "Not really. Not the whole thing." She nodded slowly, in that way she does when she's decided not to push, but she's worried. And honestly, that should have been the moment I stopped and asked myself the hard question. But I didn't. I just kept folding towels and changed the subject to something about our mom's upcoming visit. There were small things too, little moments I brushed off at the time that I look back on now and cringe at. I bought the same brand of coffee Dan used to drink, even though Ray never asked for it. I found myself using little phrases Dan used to say, like calling a bad day a real doozy, which is such a specific, weird thing to say that Ray actually asked me once where I picked that up, and I lied and said my dad used to say it. My dad has never said doozy in his life. Once, at a grocery store, I grabbed a specific brand of dish soap without even thinking, and Ray asked why that one when the store brand was cheaper, and I just said, Habit, and moved on. But it wasn't Habit. It was Dan's brand. It had always been Dan's brand. I was quietly rebuilding a marriage inside a relationship and calling it falling in love. The disaster happened at his sister's birthday dinner. We were at a restaurant, 12 people, big round table, candles, the whole thing, and everyone was laughing about some story from when Ray and his sister were kids. I was a little tipsy off 2 glasses of wine, which for me is a lot because I don't really drink anymore. Ray reached over and put his hand on the back of my neck, the way he does when a table is loud and he wants to check in with me quietly. And I turned my head and without thinking, without even a half second of hesitation, I said, "Thank you, baby," using Dan's name. I said Dan's actual first name, clear as day, at a table of 12 people. The table didn't go instantly silent like in a movie. It took a second for it to land. His sister actually laughed first, thinking she misheard. Then Ray's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't anger, it was almost like watching someone get told bad news in slow motion. His hand came off my neck like my skin had gone cold. He didn't say anything at the table. He was too polite for that. Too raised right for that. He just picked up his water glass, drank the whole thing, and changed the subject to the birthday cake. We didn't talk in the car for 11 minutes. I counted, because I was staring at the dashboard clock trying to figure out what to even say. When we got inside, he sat down on the edge of the bed and asked, very quietly and very calmly, if I could tell him who Dan was. I had genuinely never said his name to Ray, not once in 5 months, which now, sitting here typing this, feels insane. But grief makes you do insane things. It makes you build entire rooms in your life that other people aren't allowed to walk into. I told him everything. The run, the heart, the hospital hallway, the 12-cat comment to my sister. I told him about the grief group and the coffee smell hitting me at our first date, and how I never said anything because I didn't want to ruin what felt like the first good thing in 2 years. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, which is very Ray. When I finished, he didn't yell. He didn't even really look hurt anymore. He just asked one question. He said, "Do you love me or do you love how I remind you of him?" I didn't have an answer for that, not that night. I told him I didn't know, and I think that honesty was the only thing that kept him from walking out right then, because a lie probably would have ended it faster. He slept on the couch that night, which had never happened before in 5 months, and I lay awake in bed alone, in a room that smelled like him, or like Dan, or like both, and I genuinely could not have told you the difference anymore. That terrified me more than losing Dan ever did, because losing Dan was something that happened to me. This was something I was doing to myself, and the worst part was, some small, clear voice in the back of my head had been saying it for months. You know what this is? And you keep choosing not to look at it directly, because looking at it meant admitting the whole relationship I had built my recovery around might not really be about the man asleep on my couch at all. Here's the twist nobody saw coming, including me. 2 days later, Ray sat me down and told me something I did not expect. He said he needed to tell me something too, and I actually got scared, thinking he was about to break up with me. Instead, he told me that 4 years before we met, his college girlfriend died of an overdose, someone he'd planned on marrying, and that after her, he spent 3 years dating no one because he was terrified of loving someone that hard again. He said the reason he never pushed me to talk about my past, the reason he was so patient about pace, was because he recognized exactly what he was looking at, because he had lived inside it himself. He said something that I still think about almost every day. He said, "I think we found each other because we were both looking for someone who understood how to be careful with something broken. But that's not the same as being ready." And I don't think either of us was actually ready. We were just relieved not to be doing it alone anymore. We didn't break up that week. We actually tried hard for another 2 months. We went to a counselor together, which was Ray's idea, not mine. And in one of those sessions, the counselor asked me a question that cracked something open. She asked if I could picture loving Ray as Ray, not as an extension of missing Dan. I sat there in that office and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the actual funeral, because the honest answer in that moment was I didn't know, and not knowing after 7 months together was its own kind of answer. We ended it on a Sunday, which felt fitting somehow. No big scene, no yelling. He helped me carry Biscuit's dog bed out to his truck, and at the door he hugged me for a long time and said, "I hope the next person gets all of you, not just the parts that smell familiar." Then he left, and I stood in my kitchen, and for the first time in 2 years, I cried about Dan and only Dan. Not about a breakup, not about being alone again, just about him, just about missing my husband, clean and simple, without anyone else's cologne standing in the middle of it. It's been a year and a half since Ray. I did eventually date again, slower this time. I told the next guy about Dan on our second date on purpose, out loud, using his name, so it would never again live as a secret sitting under everything I did. That relationship lasted about 4 months, and it ended for regular boring reasons. We just wanted different things, not because of any ghost sitting between us. Honestly, that felt like a strange kind of victory, even in the ending of it. There was no cologne, no name slipping out at a dinner table, no counselor asking me hard questions I couldn't answer. It was just two people who tried, and it didn't work, which is such a normal thing to be able to say. And for a long time, I didn't think I'd get to say something that normal again. I finally donated Dan's clothes about 8 months ago. My sister came with me. We didn't talk much in the car. She just held my hand at the red lights. The boots were the hardest part. Not the shirts, not even his wedding ring, which I still keep in a little box in my dresser, but the boots, because I could still see the exact shape of his feet worn into them. Dropping that bag off at the donation center felt like the actual funeral in a way the real one, 4 years earlier, never quite did. Because back then I was too numb to feel anything all the way through. I'm not with anyone right now, and I'm okay with that. I go to a different grief group now, one that isn't in a church basement. It's in a community center that smells like nothing in particular, which honestly feels like exactly where I'm supposed to be. I think about Ray sometimes, not with regret exactly, more like gratitude, because he's the reason I finally understood the difference between missing someone and using someone to make the missing quieter. I used to think being afraid to love again meant staying closed off forever, but nobody warns you about the other version, the version where you open back up too fast and hand your grief to the first person who accidentally smells like home. So if you're asking whether I'm afraid to love again, the honest answer is a little, but it's a different fear now. It's not the fear of losing someone, it's the fear of loving someone for the wrong reasons again and mistaking relief for the real thing. That fear I actually think is healthy. That fear is the reason I finally slowed down enough to grieve my husband the whole way through, instead of skipping the hard part by finding someone who smelled like an easier way out. Pam from the old grief group texts me every so often just to check in. Last month she asked if I was seeing anyone and I told her, no, not right now. She sent back one line that I actually screenshotted and saved. She said, good, take your time. Love isn't going anywhere. It's not a bus. You don't have to catch it before the doors close. I think about that more than I think about almost anything else these days, because for years I treated love like exactly that, a bus I was terrified of missing forever. And it turns out the version worth having was never in a hurry at all. It was just waiting quietly for me to actually be ready to get on.